afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to our live virtual event to celebrate the Standards Council of Canada 50th anniversary. I'm Chantal Gay, CEO of the Standards Council of Canada, and I'm very proud to represent and lead SCC during this milestone. I want to begin by acknowledging that I join you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. First, you will see on your Zoom screen, along the bottom of the screen to the right, the option to have this event broadcast to you in English or French. Please select the language of your choice by clicking on the globe button. Zoom vous permet de suivre la transmission anglaise ou française du webinaire. Je vous invite donc à choisir la langue qui vous convient en appuyant sur le globe en bas de votre écran à droite. As today's moderator and MC, I am delighted to lead us through this exciting celebration that showcases the world of standards and conformity assessment and to introduce you to some of today's global influencers. I will also have the honor of revealing the 2020 SCC Award winners, the dedicated and dynamic people who shape our field and inspire others through their everyday work. Before we jump in, I would like to make a few housekeeping comments to ensure this virtual event goes smoothly. As members of the audience, you will have an opportunity to type questions in the Q&A feature, which will be moderated. We will aim to answer as many questions as we can. If we do not get to your question, you can always reach us at info@scc.ca. This event will be recorded and used in promotional and engagement opportunities on our website and on our social media channels. Nous avons des participantes et des participants des 4 coins du Canada et du monde entier, ce qui démontre que nous formons véritablement une communauté mondiale. As we recognize Black History Month, I want to highlight that inclusivity and diversity is very important for SCC. We are proud to work with a vast and diverse network around the world. We are also joined today by SCC staff who share a rich and diverse background. As you watch today's event, I hope you find opportunities and inspiration in the work we do and how we can unite for positive change. I'd also like to recognize and extend our gratitude to the Ministry of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development for their strong and continued support, and a special warm welcome to Minister François-Philippe Champagne to the portfolio. As this year marks SCC's 50th anniversary, we have developed special content to shine the spotlight on standardization, its impact, and the impressive people who bring their expertise to the network to help shape standardization for the benefit of humanity. Please visit our website and share this exclusive 50th anniversary content within your own networks. As many of you have seen this year, we have refreshed our brand and updated our logo and tagline to represent our organization as we look to the future. At SCC, we open a world of possibilities. Avec notre expertise et notre vaste réseau, le Conseil canadien des normes aide les organismes à découvrir un monde de possibilités au pays comme à l'étranger. We bring people together, foster collaboration, and expand their horizons in trade and global connectivity. We represent and advance Canada's interest on the international stage in a way no other organization can. SCC offers more than a few pieces of the standards development and conformity assessment puzzle. We provide comprehensive strategies that allow Canadian businesses and innovators to shape established and emerging markets. En facilitant l'élimination des obstacles au commerce et l'ouverture de débouchés, nous aidons les entreprises à innover et à bâtir des assises solides pour percer sur de nouveaux marchés. Now, this past year has demonstrated the critical role of standardization in addressing the world's most pressing challenges, from the pandemic to climate change to gender equality and diversity. We can all agree that there is an undeniable need to make improvements across all facets of society and the economy. I know that by working with our diverse network and those present here today, we at the Standards Council of Canada can deliver opportunities for solutions. Together, we will contribute new ideas and make concrete change. In this spirit, I want to especially thank the visionaries and trailblazers we will hear from today. First, Christelle van der Els, our keynote speaker. Our 5 panelists who will dive into a thought-provoking discussion on standardization for the benefit of humanity. Christophe Winterhalter, Eric Meslin, Lena Dargam, Sheila Leggett, and Mary Malmquist-Nielsen. And of course, SCC's acting chair, Mr. Colin Clark, who will be delivering our annual public meeting address later this afternoon. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Christelle van der Els, Director General of Policy Horizons Canada at the Government of Canada. Christelle has been working for 2 decades in forward-looking strategy and policy advisory roles. She works with senior executives and policymakers, providing the insights, resources, and processes to help turn long-term strategic thinking into actions and impacts. She is also the CEO of the Global Foresight Group. She is a member of the OECD Governmental Foresight Community, a fellow at the Center for Strategic Foresight of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe. Christelle, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and Policy Horizons today to come and celebrate with you, Chantal, Colin, distinguished panelists. We're really happy to be here. And first of all, before starting on the keynote, we just, from myself and from Policy Horizons, félicitations, congratulations on the 50th anniversary of the Standard Council of Canada. So before going into kind of some of the big disruptions that we might see on the horizons, which I've been asked to talk about, maybe a little word about Policy Horizons Canada. We are the central foresight unit of the Canadian federal government. And so we're looking at how the policy landscape changes over time in the future so that we can support our decision makers when they develop future-oriented policies and programs. And so we've been quite engaged with also the Standard Council, because obviously as the Standard Council is moving into the next decade, it's really important to develop good foresight, and it's so evident that that foresight is required, and the Standard Council is doing great work. The work itself of the Standard Council is by nature forward-looking. The Standard Council shapes the future because it's improving Canadians' health, well-being, and economic prosperity. And now it has to do that actually in a vastly changing world that is full of plurality, ambiguity, and novelty. So we wish you all the best. And like all other public institutions, of course, we need to look at things kind of from 2 perspectives when you'll be listening to some of these big disruptions that are coming up. First, we want to really think about kind of what might happen in the future. What type of futures might we encounter? What might it look like? How might it be different from what we're expecting? So that we as public institutions can be prepared for a variety of scenarios and avoid finding ourselves in situations of radical change that we're completely unprepared to manage. And secondly, beyond this, the SEC is of course not a passive participant in the future because its decisions shape the future. So it's really crucial that the Standard Council is thinking about the future that it wants to enable, or the futures it wants to enable. So reflecting on what needs to be transformed, where is innovation needed to create a desirable future, and how standards can contribute to this. And so it's a great session actually to be part of today. So what are some of those changes we want to reflect on? Before I dive into it, also just reminding everyone, we are not in the business of predicting the future, we are in the business of contemplating what is possible. as futures, so that we can be prepared for several types of futures when they emerge. So it's hard these days, obviously, to talk about the future without talking about the consequences of the pandemic. We're all experiencing it. Otherwise, this meeting would probably be in person. So it does have benefits of being able to have a broad variety of people come together and think about the future. But the world is really in the midst of the highest levels of economic, political, and social uncertainty in decades, and the number of known unknowns is just extremely high. In the work that we've been doing, reflecting on the COVID-19 pandemic implications, we've seen that certain trends are accelerating. We're seeing disruption, obviously. There's a lot of opportunities and possibilities that have opened up. And what is certainly a certainty is that the realm of we consider to be the possible has vastly extended. So, and although sometimes we think that the short-term change is overestimated, very often long-term change is underestimated. So as we're looking at the future, there's still a lot of uncertainties, of course. First, from the health perspective, globally, there's still a significant uncertainty about whether we will control the virus and when. So despite the excitement and the existence of the vaccines, the questions really remain around, as you know, about global availability, the long-term effectiveness of vaccines, but also the evolution of the virus itself. That influences, obviously, what we're thinking about the economic scenarios that we might be encountering. The longer the pandemic lasts, the more there is kind of a basis to start thinking that the economic recovery or the economic development will have a K-shape. So it's kind of going to be the K curve, as people talk about, where there's a number of people, industries, and countries that are coming very well out of this pandemic. They're doing well, and sometimes they will come out even stronger. So it's kind of the little K, leg of the K that is going up. But a lot of countries, people, and industries might end up being on the lower leg of the K, where many will bear the consequences. And that, of course, informs also what we might be thinking about when we look at the socioeconomic landscape that we will be seeing in the future, because there is a higher risk, obviously, of very heavily ingrained and built-in increased inequality, decreasing social cohesion, and a more pronounced generational and regional divide. In the long term, we're also seeing that supply chains would be redesigned, obviously, because there is a need to make supply chains more resilient and also to produce locally what might be now qualified as strategically important goods or essential goods. But beyond the immediate, let's say, economic consequences of the pandemic itself, COVID has actually accelerated a lot of the aspects that we at Policy Horizons looked at when we looked at next digital economy and the future of work, which you can consult also on our website. We've seen a lot of digitization happening, of course, in the world, but we have to prepare in the coming decade, and quite soon, actually, because there's a broad suite of technologies that are maturing and combining, and they're redefining the organizing principles of the economy. So big changes still, more changes coming up. We will see a real revolution of the value chains. We'll see an introduction of different models of production and consumptions of goods and services. And we will see, as you know, changes to the nature of work, including kind of what, how, where, and by who work will be done. But we're also seeing, and that's something we're looking closely at it now for the moment, is looking at how that technological innovation will shift how and where economic value gets created in the economy and the business models, and how that will ultimately impact prices, wages, interest rates, and rents. And this has been quite important in light also of COVID, because it was one of those things that we were thinking the world had to kind of reckon with in the coming decade, but the time frame has vastly shortened on all of those issues. As you know, we're all working from home, at least those who can. We're also seeing huge investments in the supply chains to eliminate people, not only because out of a rationale to optimize for reducing employee costs, but now the aim of many of those investments become to take the human out of the value chain, because the human has become now a major risk factor. And we're also seeing that digital infrastructure is actually becoming a defining factor in our economic, educational, and health outcomes. So we have the next digital economy coming up and all its consequences and implications at a speed that is going faster than we would have expected before COVID. COVID has really accelerated that trend. Now, at the same time, we're also going to experience in the coming years the convergence of the physical world and the cyber world, or what people call the Internet of Things, which also come with vast positive evolutions for society, but it comes with its own set of issues around privacy, trust, and security, of course. And in parallel, if all this wasn't enough, we will see the convergence of the digital and the biological systems. We call that the biodigital convergence, and it's really fascinating. It is opening kind of new striking ways to change human beings, our bodies, our minds, or our behaviors. We can in different ways change or create organisms. We can change our ecosystems. We have now different ways that we can sense, store, process, and transmit information. Different ways how we can manage our biological innovation and how we can structure and manage production and supply chain. So this whole biological convergence, which is one further step of how the economy will change in the coming decades, is not, again, just a technological change. It will transform economic and trade models. It will profoundly transform industries such as manufacturing, healthcare, and agriculture. It will transform how we think about ourselves and even what we consider to be human and natural. So we're thinking there that we're really kind of at the beginning of a period of huge, rapid expansion. If you remember, we're thinking we're a bit at the time that digital computing was in the mid-80s, except that change will go faster than taking about 35 years to create a vastly different world. And again, COVID is playing a role here. For instance, just in terms of the collection of the vast amounts of DNA samples that is now going on the basis of COVID testing. And we're also seeing that there's a lot of boundaries that are being rethought between of what we think is acceptable from what we consider to be private to us and what can be less private in the interest of public health and public security. So a lot of things are changing regarding that biodigital convergence, but all these changes, whether it's the economy or linking up with the physical infrastructure and the cyberspace, and connecting that also to our bodies and the environment, it's holding big changes, but it's holding many, many big questions where we have to reflect on what do we want a society to be and what are some of those trade-offs. And of course, that's also where you can think about how standards can help that. But beyond kind of all these technological and economic transformation, we're also very much believing that you have to look at what is really shifting deeply in society. And that's what we do in our social foresight work. We believe that there will be great changes over the coming decade in the way we connect to each other, how we make sense of the world, how we make collective decisions, how we relate to ourselves and the environment. And that will drive a lot of it's kind of an underlying basis that drives a lot of what we will see in terms of what we think is acceptable as technological and scientific changes, as what we think is acceptable and okay as economic and social economic realities. And it will also influence tremendously how international relations play out. One of the things we're deeply looking into is social connection, the future of social connection. As we know, loneliness is quite, was already significant before, also contributed partially by technology. But the the pandemic has also now shown how important is actually that social connections is one of the biggest bases of social resilience. And so if we want to really build a society that is more resilient, we have to think about how we alleviate some of that social connection deficit. And there might be great innovations that we might see there. So we're also looking very much at how there is change in how the people make sense of the world. You might have noticed with very, very recent examples that the way people make sense of the world, which is driving their behaviors and is driving action, is becoming increasingly diverse, distinct, and competing. And that plays out at the level of groups within society, of people of groups within society, but also at the international level between nations. And we're thinking that in the future, we hope we're never coming to kind of a space where some of those gaps become unsurmountable. But we cannot assume that everyone's needs, expectations, values, ethical standards, preferences are the same. And we've seen this play out in the US a couple of weeks ago. And we're also seeing that play out in a lot of the responses to the pandemic measures. But ultimately, kind of how we make sense of the world will guide and the values that we're holding, or the different values that we're holding across sense-making systems, will provide kind of foundational layers on how this whole technological and scientific evolution will happen. But it is for sure, the future will be significantly driven by technology and scientific innovation, and policy setting, regulations, and standards have key functions for defining whether these evolutions will be beneficial or not to society. Because all of these levers to shape the future, they're not value neutral. They hold values, they're based on values. So we have to think about what we want the world to be. And what we might see also in terms of disruptions in this area is that we might come to a world where we have the emergence of distinct technological and scientific innovation systems and markets, which is posing yet another important context for international standard setting, obviously. And so that great diversity, the increasing diversity of sense-making models might also be at the basis, along with economics, of some of what we see there to be as emerging strategic competition between nations and blocs, driving the redesign of strategic alliances between countries and the international order. And then to close, if we're talking about disruptions, obviously there is one big change we haven't mentioned yet, which is obviously changes to the climate, the loss of biodiversity, and the change in the availability of natural resources. They provide kind of an important context with a space of great disruption that will influence all the above. So in conclusion, significant disruptions to come. Brace yourself. Change is not likely to go away. It's likely to speed up, become more significant in how it kind of permeates into our lives. And so we have to think about it. The window of opportunity for public institutions to shape that future has shortened, and that's really important to realize, has shortened because of COVID also, because a lot of change and innovation has happened. Many decisions have been made and certain future are getting locked into. So framing the standardization as an asset for the benefit of humanity has never been more important, I believe. And so it's great that you organized the panel actually around that framing. So again, congratulations for the first 50 years and all the best for the coming decade and the following 50 years. Chantal.
Thank you so much, Christelle, for those remarks. You're setting up the table so well for us today and lots of food for thought. Thank you very much. We will now move to our panel discussion about the standardization for the benefit of humanity in the context of the great changes that Christelle has spoken about. So panel members, as visionaries and global influencers, our panelists will take us out of our comfort zone and invite us to think about the future of standards and conformity assessment and the world as it could be. They will offer insight on how all of us can contribute to making the standardization system better, more inclusive, more adaptable, and resilient, serving humanity for the next 50 years. First, we'll hear from Christophe Winterhalter, on his perspective from the innovation and technology field. Christoph is the chairman of the executive board of DIN, the German national standardization body, where he drives a customer-centric approach and digital transformation within the standardization system. Before joining DIN, he spent more than 20 years in industry working for the ABB Group. Christoph represents Germany at Commission Européenne de Normalisation, is their VP policy there. He also sits at the Council of ISO. A real pleasure to have you, Christoph. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chantal, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. But let me first thank you, Chantal, for the kind invitation and happy 50th anniversary to our young sister organization, SCC. As a former corporate research director, I'm absolutely convinced that we can only master the big challenges we are facing by using technology. Whether we are talking about the green transition, to fight climate change, the life with and after the COVID-19 pandemic, or the digital transformation, the effective utilization of new technology will play an essential role. Standardization is one of the most efficient tools to transfer new technologies from lab demonstration to broad, safe, and reliable practical use, exploiting its potential. Within its just published Strategy 2030, ISO has identified 3 goals to be addressed to serve humanity in making lives easier, safer, and better. Number 1 is meeting global needs through identification, assessment, orchestration of new standardization topics. Standardization must be planned and triggered in parallel to technology development. Standardization planning needs to become a natural part of key research programs. Especially the digital transformation brings many horizontal technologies that will have an impact on a large variety of products and offer disruptive solutions by combining features and possibilities in completely new ways. To deploy these systemic innovations in an efficient, safe, and reliable way, standards will become even more important, since they ensure interoperability of the different parts of the system and define the rules that will ensure the system behaves as intended. Developing those standards efficiently requires cooperation across technical committees and across organizations on a new level, since it will no longer be possible to allocate the responsibility, think about cybersecurity or artificial intelligence, to one single committee. Instead, we have to engage a whole community by bringing the needed expertise from various groups together. This process needs orchestration, and I'm glad that ISO has defined identification, assessment, and orchestration of standardization needs for new technologies, one of the key areas in its Strategy 2030. But how to secure a broad stakeholder participation and have all voices heard, which is goal number 2. Standardization is highly dependent on the participation of experts. It's therefore of utmost importance to promote the value of standards and establish standardization as a strategic tool for industry leaders and policymakers. This we can best achieve in a public-private partnership, where the essential requirements are defined top-down by the regulator and where the technical deployment of regulatory requirements is defined bottom-up through private standardization organizations and their experts. Joint standardization and joint orchestration ensures consistent planning of standardization activities, supporting regulation, but requires different expert levels to get involved. I'm talking about research managers, policymakers, innovation managers, that to prioritize relevant use cases, verify future standardization needs, and validate the usability of identified standards. This will help to better understand where standards are needed, how they will be used, and to avoid double work in standardization committees. And this brings me to the last aspect of how do we ensure standards used everywhere? And this will include also our vision of future delivery services for standards content. Today, our whole system is document-centric, with relevant information embedded in complex technical documents with a high level of interdependency. ISO Smart, how we call it, is our vision to be able to directly search for relevant content across standards needed to support a specific use case. To be able to provide such a service, we have to develop our standards in consistent and machine-readable structure that considers potential use case scenarios. By converting our standards from individual documents into a structured repository of technical rules, we will be able to identify relevant content for a specific use case automatically, instead of just identifying a set of documents that do contain related information. We've just started this journey, and it requires a strong participation from all stakeholders to help us achieving the ambitious targets that will offer a complete new level of access and usability. I hope I could give you a little glimpse of my future vision around standardization, and I'm extremely glad to have SCC with Chantal as one of the most active members in ISO Council, being always open-minded and open for change. It's up to us to create our future, and it's up to us to make sure that technology respects and works for humanity. And international standards are an important enabler to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for these words. And next, to provide us with a lens on ethics, we'll turn to Eric Meslin. Eric is the president and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies. Prior to this role, Eric spent 25 years in the university and government settings, including 15 years at Indiana University, where he was, among other roles, the founding director of the Center for Bioethics. Welcome, Eric.
Merci, Chantal, and thank you to my fellow panelists. Like others, congratulations to the Standards Council of Canada for its golden anniversary at 50 years, and I also bring greetings on behalf of the CCA. I've been asked to speak in 4 minutes or so about the place and role of ethics and standards today and in the future, a topic so large that it's impossible to cover without narrowing the context. So instead, I'm going to make just a preliminary comment and then give you 2 examples from my own professional background in bioethics, which is the issues that arise at the intersection of ethical, legal, social, and policy matters. First, standards are one of the many tools in the civil society toolbox, a toolbox that includes guidelines, regulations, laws, policies, protocols, decision aids, and best practices, among others, all intended to help us make progress while satisfying democratic ideals. Each have distinct features and applicability, but they share several common features. They help reduce uncertainty. They help to provide objective criteria and guidance for action. They reduce the risk of arbitrary or capricious decision-making, and they can be used to set legal or policy expectations for performance. Ethics standards, if we can put those in inverted commas, occupy a particular section of the toolkit that may not be so obvious, since at their most basic, of course, ethics is the study of morality. They are quite philosophic and quite abstract, and yet at their most applicable, they can cover everything from health to the environment to innovation. For this reason, ethics standards in particular have a profound moral dimension that they also share in common. Ethics standards are the objective expression of the ancient idea of justice, which calls us to treat like cases alike and different cases differently. A standard lets one identify similar objects of our concern and describe how anyone and everyone should treat that object similarly. They are blind to whim, to fancy, or to impulse. Ethics standards are also statements about the floors below which society does not wish us to fall, both literally and figuratively. Standards are therefore designed to protect us from harm, and therefore the policy instantiation of the principle of non-maleficence, do no harm, is how one might interpret this. And most importantly, by following and using ethics standards, standards are designed and intended to benefit us as individuals and society in general. We believe, I would submit, that we're all better off having them than not having them. Otherwise, we would live in the society that the philosopher Thomas Hobbes referred to as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, I realize these are deeply philosophic notions, and with only a few minutes left, I want to just reflect on two examples of how ethics and standards intersect now and what the challenges might be. The first comes from human research involving human participants, an ecosystem for which has been evolving for many generations, but as COVID-19 has shown us, is particularly important as the pace and scope of health research to anticipate and address issues of everything from the design and conduct of vaccine research to research on rollout, public health implementation, post-marketing surveillance, pharmacovigilance, and others, cries out for consistent, objective, evidence-based approaches to their activity. But they also cry out for approaches that prioritize ethical commitments. This is an area with a powerful social and political history dating back to the Nuremberg war crimes trials following the Second World War, and tracked with the post-war economic political moves to invest in research as part of the social contract between science and society. In the 70 years since the Nuremberg Code's description of permissible research, there has been an explosion of documents, guidelines, and statements. In fact, the U.S. Office of Health Research, Office for Human Research Protections collects these statements, which now number more than 1,000 and are across more than 130 countries. In the vast array of all of that information, two particular commitments are evidence of what one might call standards within this ecosystem. The first is the procedural requirement to obtain prior ethics review and approval of research before it is undertaken. The second is the value of the substantive requirement for seeking informed consent. I suspect everyone on this call and those listening would say, well, that's obvious. It has not been obvious. In fact, it was not obvious 70 years ago, and it is still not obvious for many people. So these two commitments are expressed everywhere, that research involving human beings is undertaken only when these procedural and substantive conditions are met. Those criteria were established essentially for clinical drug trial research and are now having to be updated regularly for everything from genomics research of the kind our guest speaker referred to in terms of using biological materials and others, to everything as well, including behavioral research, public health implementation, and of course, the exciting intersection with artificial intelligence. These issues are also, and finally, with respect to case one, examples of how conflicts between and confusion among countries who prize national sovereignty, cultural and political values above others may find themselves in areas of difficult agreement about where to set that standard. The second and final example I'll leave you with comes from the broader issue of healthcare and the particular example of privacy and confidentiality. It serves as a paradigm example because the topic of privacy and confidentiality, formerly known as secret keeping in medicine, has ancient roots going back far beyond the Oath of Hippocrates, all the way to Indian and Chinese medical ethics several thousand years before. We have been talking about the expectations of professions and society with respect to secrets made and kept as professional obligations for literally millennia. And yet we still face the challenges of today, challenges already alluded to with respect to data sharing and governance, challenges with respect to how we can provide information that will both advance human progress while protecting valuable moral commitments. I could go on at some length, but I would leave it there with one final note. While I've been asked to speak about ethics as a topic, my wish, and I will say more about this later, is that we see it as underlying everything we do in standard setting, whether it's from the accreditation operations that many organizations, including those in Canada, are undertaking, to those professional commitments that people make when they are setting them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. Our third panelist is Lena Dargam, who will address the subject from the angle of societal impacts. Lena is the Director General of the Lebanese Standards Institution, LIBNOR, since 2014. She has contributed to the development of the Lebanese standardization system and the elaboration of the legal framework related to the quality infrastructure in Lebanon. Lena is currently the president of Réseau Normalisation et Francophonie and also served as the chair of the ISO Committee for Developing Countries, DEFCO, until 2020. Bienvenue, Lena.
Merci Chantal et toutes mes félicitations pour le 50e anniversaire.
Thank you, Chantal. Congratulations for the 50th anniversary. This is an exceptional year after a 50-year existence. And in light of the societal and economic impacts we are hit with right now, growing inequality will lead to new needs in terms of standard setting. The rules of the game have changed, but this brings challenges, but also opportunities. And we have to be ready for a sustainable and transformative recovery, which puts the well-being of people front and center. So what is the role for standards in supporting this recovery in this new social compact, in this new world governance that was mentioned by the Secretary General of the United Nations last week? We in the standards field have been working hard to make people's lives easier, safer, and better, and to contribute to social and economic well-being and improvement in quality of life. But what does this mean to us in this time of crisis with these fundamental upsets and the changes that we have seen in consumer behavior as well as that of industry and investors? How can standards in the coming years give us a substantial solution? And what are the lessons learned from this crisis that we can use in the future? Were we agile enough? Did we have the right tools in order to prepare for the future? Will we have a quick enough response to meet these changes? Will we be able to develop tools that reduce inequality and increase social well-being, particularly amongst vulnerable populations, women, the elderly, young people, migrants, people with disabilities, particularly those who live in countries that are in development? According to UNHCR, 79 million people were uprooted in 2019. These are amongst the most vulnerable populations. And given geopolitical instability and climate change, this number is growing. How can we help the welcoming countries in their problems when they receive these migrants? Do we have the proper standards in the humanitarian sector? Organizations such as OECD have pointed out the need to develop standards to measure the impact of subsidies, investments, and sustainable development projects. So where are we as standards organizations? And what are the lessons we've learned from 2020 in terms of work, remote work, mental health, the psychological security of teams? We should think about these subjects while opening minds by broadening the number of tools and services we are ready to supply to help meet these new international trends.
With value creation that's shared and across the board, and we'll be able to act much more quickly than we have already, and we will be much more equipped, and we will be able to work and identify all of the future changes and the needs and the changes and the needs that are there. Thanks to changes in technology, we will be able to ensure that our products be used everywhere by everyone and for the good of all. Thank you, Lena.
From an environmental management perspective, Shayla has worked at the interface of energy and environment throughout her career. She has served on various corporate, non-for-profit, and government agency boards. She is currently the international chair of the ISO Technical Committee 207, Environmental Management, responsible for the ISO 14000 series of standards. Welcome, Shayla.
Thank you very much, Chantal. And I would add my congratulations to SCC on your 50th anniversary. And also thank you for the invitation to join this panel. In my view, standardization for the benefit of humanity is an absolutely audacious and critical topic. And I salute you for having this discussion. It's inspiring as a Canadian to see SCC initiating a discussion like this and bringing together so many relevant and diverse perspectives. I believe that we as a society are making important strides to look at the world more holistically. And the recognition of that within the context of sustainable development is, in my opinion, fundamental to our way forward. Chantal referenced the fact that I chair the TC 207, and we recently amended our scope for that committee. And it now reads standardization in the field of environmental management to address environmental and climate impacts, including related social and economic aspects in support of sustainable development. Now, this is something that many of us, and I'll be aging myself, thought that this would have been in place decades ago, but this is now just truly coming to fruition. And I'm so pleased to see this happening, and we need to move forward from there. The field of environmental management is complex and filled with many unknowns. Standards help us define what is known and also helps us understand where are our knowledge gaps. We need this kind of rigor, and we need it to be committed to on an international basis. Two examples of standards where I believe they've helped, and I'd like to share with you, and where I believe that we can do so much more going forward. During a part of my career, I served as a regulator, including regulating Canada's energy systems that are under federal jurisdiction. A question we received repeatedly from people and organizations seeking to understand the process was how we would decide whether or not a project was in the public interest. The organization had adopted standards related to engineering aspects of projects, which had been derived over many years. This process has been in place for over 40 years, and those engineering standards are now in their 19th edition. It was a given that any company operating under that regulatory framework would meet or exceed those standards. However, there weren't standards in place for other aspects of projects, including environmental, economic, and social. We need standards to be available for areas beyond the engineering design for our regulators. Without these, I believe we do ourselves a disservice to our productivity and prosperity. The second example I'd like to talk about relates to the conversations that are currently happening around ESG. I believe that we're at an important time where there's global interest in having unified frameworks, or maybe even a framework. I think there's an imperative and exciting opportunity for standards to help shape the path forward. Underneath however many ESG frameworks that emerge will be the need for the details of what delivers a solid framework. Nowhere, in my view, is there a better place for the adoption of standards which have been arrived at through a global consensus decision-making process. So where do we go from here? It's my firm belief that we need to harmonize our efforts to develop standards and to find ways for standards to be adaptively incorporated into the marketplace in an effective and efficient manner. In my view, there are too many groups writing standards now, and it is causing confusion amongst the users and also for those who are developing standards. This is an area of public interest, and I believe that government support and policies are needed to pull these efforts together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shayla. And finally, to give us insight from the conformity assessment perspective, I'd like to introduce Mary Malmquist Nielsen. Mary has 40 years of experience in the Swedish and European quality infrastructure system, including conformity assessment, accreditation, and elimination of technical barriers to trade. She finished her career as the acting Director General of SWEDAC, the Swedish accreditation body, and the chair of International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation, also known as ILAC. Mary works now as an independent consultant. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd also like everyone else, to start by congratulating SCC for 50 years of serving not only the Canadian market, but also the global standardization. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this event. Now, there are two main challenges with which we're struggling today. One is the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, and the other is adapting to the innovations which define the Industrial Revolution 4.0. Both challenges require innovative thinking and a groundbreaking change of attitude. Technologies do not always have predetermined outcomes for societies. Policy choices, social dialogue, and public opinion all shape the ends to which technology is deployed. And the most desirable of solutions we come up with should be those which use the technology of the new industrial revolution as a leverage to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In the middle of these challenges, we have the global quality infrastructure, which has evolved over many years and is conservative by design and nature. For the actors of this well-established environment, new ideas and change can be scary, especially if we believe that these new ideas and changes need to conform to old values and old truths. The conformity assessment trends which can be expected in the landscape of Industrialization 4.0 are many. Just to give a few examples, drones are already being used for monitoring and inspection. Test methods may be updated through machine learning and artificial intelligence. Digital testing may come to replace physical testing. Digital twins and 3D printing may be used to emulate objects for testing or product certification. So there are many examples to be given. The digital transformation of the conformity assessment community will require not only new technology, but also new values and a new mindset. So is conformity assessment in its present form going to become an extinct business, having outlived its own use? Or will it succeed in transforming and reinventing itself? In this landscape, standards bodies have a major role. Yet, the standardization process itself is conservative and reactive. Where technology is making exponential leaps, being reactive means always lagging behind. And also, the members of the working groups do not necessarily include innovators and researchers. So standards bodies need to review their processes and working principles and consider better cooperation with independent think tanks. The quality infrastructure and all of its elements build on standards. If standards cannot keep up with development and innovation, neither will the other institutions of QI, maybe with the possible exception of metrology. Quality infrastructure is a system needs to promote self-criticism, thinking outside the box, discussing unconventional solutions and problems before they become the elephant in the room, and also start working to a triple bottom line: functionality, safety, and sustainability. I have confidence that the organizations of the global quality infrastructure will be able to take some big steps which have the potential to leave a substantially positive footprint for sustainable trade and the well-being of all living creatures and the environment. So I'm challenging you now to change, to dare be vulnerable and make mistakes. You might not get it right the first time, but it will be good enough. And remember, we do not learn from our successes. They only make us complacent. We learn from our mistakes and from our painful struggles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I will now invite all panelists to turn on the video because we are going to start, I think, what's going to be a fantastic discussion. And before, so everybody's there, excellent. And before I turn to the audience for questions, and I invite right now the audience to type in questions, I do have one question that I would like some of you to consider. From all your remarks, it's obvious to me that we need to change, we need to transform, we need to evolve. So maybe I'll start with you, Shayla. In your opinion, what do you believe are the current elements of our system that we should keep?
Thanks, Chantal. I think that's a great question from the perspective of we're all being driven to catch up, to change, and to have the opportunity to reflect on what we should keep. I found very valuable. And it came to me that it's the long established framework that we have for international cooperation in developing standards and the commitment of the national standards bodies to be fully engaged at both the international table, but as well within their own countries. So enabling the diverse, expert, and innovative engagement nationally that can then be shared internationally. And in my view, that's the secret sauce. And I really hope we can figure out how to keep that.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Lena, j'aimerais beaucoup aussi entendre ton opinion.
I'd also like to hear from you on this issue. So what are the elements of current standardization systems that we need to preserve? Thank you, Chantal, for this interesting question. I think the only thing that I'd really like to keep in the way in which we work are the integrated principles in our processes. So credibility, consent-based work, representation, and impartiality. Because these principles give overall pertinence of the international standards that we're working on developing.
I'm curious to see if Christophe or Eric might want to, or Mary, anything to add to what you believe that, of this current system, other elements that you believe that are fundamental that we keep.
I'd add two quick things. They may be so obvious as to not require statement, but focus on rigor and objectivity seems to me to be extremely important to avoid, as I was referring to earlier, sort of whimsical or capricious decision-making. The rigor with which a process stands gives confidence to those who are using it. I also think that as a second, please keep it and don't get rid of it, is the recognition that I think all of us said in various ways about keeping our eye on the prize, that this is about humanity. The end is about people. As I say, these are obvious statements, but perhaps we should never forget what the goal is, and the goal is to make lives and people better.
Thank you, Eric. Christophe.
If I may add to that, I think the core of what we do is consensus, is having all relevant stakeholder groups around the table and reach consensus. And then based on that consensus, really apply a single standard model, that we eliminate competing standards to have a true standard that is based on consensus, that can be developed on a national level with very low kind of barriers to participate, and then deploy it on an international scale to think about how that will kind of be deployed in other countries as well. So I think that is the core of standardization, to reach consensus, which will take time in some cases, but that's the core that ensures quality of what we do.
Thank you very much, Christophe. I'll now go to questions from the audience. So Kendra, you want to maybe read the first question, please?
Yes, so we have one here from Fred Lieber. Everyone concedes that technology is advancing at a breakneck pace. One of my biggest challenges in standards development is to keep up with the rate of change. A new tech approach to an existing application is welcomed with open arms and implemented many times before potentially negative side effects have been identified. How can we mitigate this potential for harm within the standards network?
Mary, we thought you maybe want to try to tackle this one first anyway.
Oh dear, yes. Well, My idea is that the standardization process is far too conservative in nature due to the way the working procedures are set up. And the standardization process that I know best of is how Casco standards are developed. So we do not have this element. We have the same people coming back at each systematic review, and the bottom line always ends up being, well, don't change too much. We've just invested in how to implement the new standard, and it's going to cost everyone so much money. So there's not this new blood dimension into reviewing and redrafting standards. And I think that's what we really need. I don't mean we should be losing the expertise that has been assimilated, but we do need new people who have maybe a better feeling as to how the future will be looking. And that's why I said we need better interaction with think tanks. Maybe ISO as a central organization and each national body has to have its own group of people who are not professional standards makers, but who are able to see where industry is going and where the new things will come. Remember when internet came, someone said, oh, that's just a fly that's going to disappear in just a couple of months. And it became the big thing. So we do need to have people who can see beyond here and now in the standardization process.
Thank you very much, Mary. Oh, Christophe, please. That's a very good topic, a good question. Go ahead.
I mean, Chantal, I said it in my introduction. I mean, we need to get involved early. That already requires a change in the process, because we're not defining what is state-of-the-art technology, because we are kind of scanning, we are prioritizing new technologies, and then we're getting involved, which is an attitude from our side to be more agile, to be willing to kind of update the standard more frequently, which is maybe a different product, like a firm standard that we have today. And on the other hand, I mean, the technology developers, the innovator, they must be motivated to work with standardization, because we are open enough to really learn from their new ideas and really think what kind of standards might be required to make that technology fly. And that will help us to identify potential drawbacks in the very early stage, even though these tech nerds that are just willing to kind of turn their technology into a product, they need to think about potential implications of their technology. That will help us all in order to have a safe technology made available to the general public, and not just having fancy lab demonstrators that will never fly because they haven't thought about all the aspects that will come up if we have a multi-stakeholder approach discussing implications.
Mary, you want to jump back in? You're muted, though.
Yes, I mean, you said something, Christophe, which triggered something I've said at another seminar, and it's I'm sort of struggling as to how to put this. Sorry, I'll have to come back later.
No problem. Eric, please.
I was actually going to channel Mary's comments to offer mine when she was talking about essentially multi-track issues going on. I don't think this is limited to a pace of change issue. I actually think it is a multi-stream pace of change issue. And what I mean by that is I'm sort of reminded of, Thomas Friedman's book, the New York Times author. He wrote a book called Thank You for Being Late, which I would say is a must read, in which he describes the pace of technologic advance is going not just quickly, like really fast, but many technologies are intersecting at the same time, so that it is not simply a matter of picking that one horse and riding it. You have technologies that are turning over every 3 or 4 years, and the amount of time it takes to get standards or regulations or policies in place has already passed by the time the technology doesn't stay still. Shayla knows this story, knows these stories, I'm sure, intimately. So some of this is about nimbleness but some of it is also about the capacity to move quickly and deliberately in the face of multi-stream technology development.
Mary, you're back, and then Shayla, please.
Yes, just a second. Yes, I am on. Normally, when people apply for research funding, they get the question, what problem are you going to solve? No one asks them, is your solution going to be able to be produced sustainably? Is it going to contribute to better life for human beings? Is it going to be a sustainable solution? You know, what are the risks of the technology you're going to develop? Those questions are never asked. We just look at the problem, and I've sat in some of those funding, board of directors. That is the only question they have to answer. What problem have you identified, and how are you going to solve it? But not all the other things that are the values that need to be met at the same time in order to contribute to a sustainable development. Those questions aren't there, and they need to be among the questions to be answered by innovators and researchers when they apply for funding.
Thank you, Mary. Shayla, you wanted to contribute?
I'll just make a quick contribution in that my panel mates are expressing many things that I believe strongly in, and so I'm feeling like I'm making new friends during this discussion, which I really appreciate. I wanted to go back to Mary's comment about failing and being okay with that and being able to move forward. And I think that maybe in standard setting, that's something that's an observation of mine. Experts don't fail. They just do really good things all the time, but they never fail. And so we have to give ourselves that permission to fail. And I think that was something that Mary was talking about. And the other point I'd just like to make on this is that I totally agree with the conversation, the way it's going. I think in order for us to become nimble, we probably need to take a step back and come up with a set of principles. Again, going back to some of Mary's comments about the values that need to be considered as well, that will guide us as to how we make decisions in what standards we need to concentrate our efforts into, and how do we figure out how to consolidate all these multi-laneways that we're dealing with.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Kendra to go to the next. We have a lot of questions to go to the next question.
Yes, we do. We have the next one is about diversity and standardization. As alluded to by many of the guest speakers, there is power in both of these. Thinking about this in the context of complex social and economic systems and challenges, how do we balance this in the future, both in terms of standards creation, but also in terms of implementing standards and adapting them to diversity?
Anyone? Eric, please.
I'll tell you a fast story that relates to my opening remarks. I was referring to health research or medical research. And in one of my former lives at Indiana University, we had an 8-year relationship with a teaching and research hospital in Western Kenya in Eldoret. And the purpose of that collaboration was to develop joint research programs between these two universities. We all agreed that we had to have similar standards for how that would work, because we were undertaking research funded by our respective national funding agencies. In the US, it was the National Institutes of Health. In Kenya, it was the Kenyan Medical Research Institute. We all agreed off the top of it was very easy. We had a lovely meeting in a boardroom in Western Kenya, preceded by Kenyan tea, and it was very enjoyable. And our goal was to have a memorandum of understanding. We all agreed that we should have prior ethics review by a recognized committee, and we all agreed that informed consent is a principle that cannot be challenged in any way. Those are basic and fundamental ethical principles for medical research. And we congratulated ourselves by completing that MOU, until one person said in the room, that's all very well and good, but you realize that in many parts of Kenya, where we have 42 different tribes, that permission for research by anyone is given by the male head of household and not by women. That's how it is done. So happy to sign the MOU, but you need to understand that the interpretation and application of that principle locally will look differently. And I'm not telling you a secret. I've written this paper and it's published in the peer review literature as an example of how to apply, and I'm using diversity in a very sort of open-ended way here, not as it might be used in a detailed way. I use that as an example, not of failure, but of joint learning. That relationship persisted and still persists today. I now get regular emails from the PIs who are the first authors on papers from research funded by grants that we established 10 years ago. So it's not whether diversity, it's how. And I think there are ways on the ground, literally on the ground, that you have to work from and not just from the top down.
Thank you, Eric. I think Lena and then Shayla, and then we'll go to the next question. So go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, thank you, Chantal. Just maybe one comment to add on what Eric has just said about the diversity. I think that it's very critical at this stage to bring new people on board. We need to have diversified group of stakeholders sitting on the table and working on the standard, thinking about investors, about startups, about SMEs, about young generation, about people with disabilities. I mean, the acceptability and the use of standards depends really on who's sitting on the table and who's really drafting the standard and writing the standard.
Thank you. Shayla, please.
I would absolutely agree with that, and just move on forward to say then we're therefore challenged as to how we can do this in a way that is inclusive. And I just leave it there.
Thank you very much. Kendra, next question, please.
Okay, we have a broad question here about developing international standards. What are some of the main challenges in developing international standards and the steps being taken to address these?
Who wants to try to tackle this one? Christophe, you want to try?
I mean, this is a very broad. I mean, the challenges are to find consensus, and not all standards are needed in all parts of the world. But it's really important, like with the diversity question, we need to think from the very beginning who will be affected by that standard and make sure that the represented stakeholder groups need to kind of sit around the table. And that also involves other parts of the world, which might be up for a complete different utilization of the standard. And that needs to be taken into account before it's kind of it has its effect. And then we kind of have a kind of a drawback understanding what we have missed out when designing the standard. So it's very important that we are very transparent what kind of ideas we have before we develop a standard and we set up, let's say, the committee that tackles it.
Anybody else wants to add anything on this one, Lena, please?
Yes, a small comment on the global relevance. I mean, this is also a challenge. I mean, how to make the international standards globally relevant and how to encourage developing countries to be also participating in the development of the standard. And from my previous experience as the DEFCO chair, we know the difficulties and the challenges that developing countries have to participate and to be actively involved in the development of the standard. So this is also a major challenge.
And technology has facilitated some of that now, right? And certainly the concern that we hear from a lot of participants is if we go back to physical meetings, then we cut them off. So we're going to have to continue to think about a good hybrid model. Kendra, next question, please.
The question, I agree with Sheila's statement that there are too many standards being written. Do the panelists have any suggestions for how better coordination might be achieved?
That's $1 million question. Sheila, please.
Well, seeing as how I put that elephant on the table, I'm happy to take a first crack at it. I do firmly believe that there is the opportunity to work collaboratively much more together. I think that we have in the past ended up in silos that haven't necessarily been helpful, but just have driven on, been developed through history. And I can tell you an example of a group that I'm having conversations with now that are a not-for-profit organization that are developing standards very specifically related to energy. And my conversation with them is, how can we work together? Because they're using 14,000 standards as the basis for what they're doing. I would suggest to you they're more nimble and able to apply the standards for specific cases than maybe we've been able to do so far in the past. So why wouldn't we merge our resources and give them the solid global consensus-based framework and then have them do the applied aspect of it and then have a feedback loop for us so that we get the feedback through ISO in terms of where improvements are needed or where we're not hitting the mark. So that's my thinking.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, Christophe, please.
I fully agree with Sheila. We need to have a mindset of embracing cooperation. Instead of everybody who tries to own a certain question and takes it in his technical committee, we need to really embrace corporations to avoid double work. And what would help also is to have a certain level of orchestration on new topics, instead of bringing up certain ideas in all technical committees that need to be kind of sorted out later on. We need to have like a prioritization and a roadmap of things that need to be done, and then assign certain tasks and discuss it with the relevant expert committees and really avoid double work, that we have like an orchestrated approach to new topics.
Of course, Eric, please.
Bien sûr.
So Sheila brought the elephant into the room. I'm just going to act like the little mouse, and I don't know if I'm intending to scare the elephant or whether...
perturbateur, là, puisqu'elle a parlé de cet éléphant qui occupe la pièce. Moi, je vais faire le rôle de la souris. Je vais être provocateur. Mais je vais essayer...
This discussion about diversity versus standardization, or are there efficiencies that can be gained by sort of hacking away at this big branching bush of standards? Because, you know, when in doubt, write a standard. When in doubt, have a guideline. I already referred to the 1,042 guidelines for human subjects research in the world, written by 133 countries. Each of them are quite relevant in their own place, and were designed with good faith intention in mind, right? So the mouse that comes into the elephant's room is the mouse about harmonization and cooperation. So I rather like the word that Christophe used, cooperation, but in my world, and I am the outsider in your world, I'm not from the standards community, I'm from a different kind of community, so I take that as a given. Our knee-jerk reaction is, let's harmonize. In fact, there's an international conference on harmonization whose job is to do exactly that, the ICH. And yet when you unpack harmonization, and I don't want to be too philosophic about the musical version of harmonization.
Pas entrer trop dans le domaine ou les aspects philosophiques, l'harmonisation, mais on s'en sert comme façon détournée de dire, vous avez...
We say, and I'm not referring to who we are or who you are, I just mean that it is used as an instrument to enforce compliance with a single standard rather than recognition of possible diverse standards. Now, I say that provocatively because I've watched this in my domain of health and research and science. I have nothing to add to other areas that are completely outside of my domain, but we're facing this now in health research. We're facing it at this moment today with respect to research on COVID vaccines. I mean, it is a case study in front of us. How shall we proceed? So I just wonder whether the harmonization, standardization, diversity, and then the consensus collaboration notion that Christophe raises may provide the recipe for answering this very large and broad question that we were posed.
Thank you very much. Kendra, have we resolved the issue with...
Est-ce qu'on a réglé le problème? Est-ce que ça a été réglé? Est-ce qu'on peut passer à la prochaine question?
If anyone is hearing French on the English channel, they can switch back to the original instead for now, and they will hear English speakers in English. I'll move to the next question. Standards bodies have only limited knowledge about the use of the standards they have developed. Often proxy indicators, such as sale of standards, national adoptions, etc., are used. What do you think standards body could use to get a better understanding of the use and impact of their standards?
Gustav, please.
I mean, the whole idea that I mentioned with kind of smart standards that will have some kind of an idea what kind of use cases will utilize this type of standard, that forces us to involve standard users into the standards development process. So it's not only the ones that are loving technology, that want to kind of define the rules, but it's also those who are going to use it afterwards. They don't need to be part of the project, even though they cannot contribute to the solution, but they can contribute with a use case, with an understanding what they actually need. And there is a big room for improvement, that we are open to really ask for the real use case of a standard and get the right people that can tell us about how it will be used in the end and bring them into the meeting. That's also a mindset change, but it's a must. It's a must going forward.
Thank you, Christoph. Shayla, please.
I absolutely agree with Christoph, and I would just add, it kind of goes back to Eric's mouse. I just add that what we're facing as a hurdle is a history of people believing that you have to be tapped on the shoulder to be in the room, and there's no other way of being involved. And outreach for people to bring them into the standards world, based on my experience, is heavy lifting and needs a strategic corporate approach to it, as opposed to being done within individual groups.
Thank you, Shayla. Okay, Kendra, one more question.
Yes, we will take this question from Leslie. Mary's comments were inspiring and daunting when thinking about the magnitude of change that is needed to create the next generation of standards development and conformity assessment. On a practical level, where do we start? How do we break the large-scale changes that are needed into sizable, achievable steps without losing sight of the long-term vision?
We're getting $1 million questions today, which is great. Mary, you want to start on this one?
I can give it a try. I'm not sure I've got the recipe for everything I've said, but I think it all boils down again to the fact that we are conservative, and I'm not part of the standards community. So I've just been a user of standards, but I've participated in some of the committee work, and the conservatism, both from who gets appointed to the international standards body committees and working groups, and also the fact that change is seen as something that is costly and unnecessary. So instead of saying, how can we put this into smaller pieces, I think we should say, how would we do this if we were to start from scratch today? How would the process look? We've got maybe 50, 100 years of experience of making standards. How would we approach it if we were to start a new standards making body today? I think that would be a better way of approaching it, instead of trying to cut it into smaller pieces and eating the elephant in small portions.
Thank you, Mary. I just hope we don't throw the baby with the bathwater. Eric, please.
Or have the baby eat the elephant while the elephant's taking a bath with the mouse. Yeah. So what's so fascinating about this group, and Sheila, I agree with you, this is my new favorite group of friends. I just find it so fascinating because it's not speaking to the same people that you always speak to and expect the same responses. But I would think, following on Mary's point, I'm going to suggest a tactic that was well used in my world of medical ethics or bioethics many, many years ago. And the basis of the tactic was the resistance by the medical community. I mean, dramatic medical resistance to being told that they needed to be taught about medical ethics, because it was almost a professional insult to suggest that they needed to be taught, you need this, and we have a group of people who will teach it to you. The analogy, of course, is we have standards and we're going to tell you what they are. We, the expert, are going to tell you, the user. And one of the innovations that worked very well, and I won't name the country, I certainly wouldn't name the university, I won't even name the country, was that the tactic that worked well was to not call the topic we were referring to medical ethics. We're not here to teach you medical ethics. We're here to teach, and we actually called it communication skills or something else. Not to hide the depth and philosophic rigor behind the topic, but sometimes the literal, and we know this from public policy, naming something, giving it a name, automatically reifies it and forces people to adopt a certain view, because only certain cool people can use that word. So I'm just wondering whether, with Mary's idea as a basis, what would we build from scratch? We don't have to say what we build from scratch is a standards organization. We say, what is needed to advance these particular goals and commitments? What are the structures that would enable that? And then we get to Christoph's point about, and who should be in the room that should help us think about what those needs are. And don't call it, I'm not suggesting Mary was proposing this, but the idea of, let's not foreclose the conversation by calling it standard creation yet. Standards are the thing that we produce in order to serve that larger goal. I don't know if that's useful, but it worked with us.
Thank you, Eric. We do have to wrap up. So I hope you're okay, because I do want to ask you one. Mary, you have your finger up? Because I want to ask you one last tidbit of insight. Okay, so I'll go there if you don't mind. It's been super interesting, and I want to thank the audience for the great questions, and I want to thank our panelists for being very open and candid about the conversation. But one more insight from all of you. What do you believe is the one thing we must do in the system today, like one thing, so that in 50 years from now, we find ourselves in a world we aspire to? One action. One sentence, please, and I'm going to start with Mary.
Well, thank you. May I start by apologizing if I was offensive, but you asked me to be provocative. So you got what you asked for, you know, and there are lots of things we're doing today which are very good. So that's not the point. That's beside the point. I think one thing we can do today is to increase the inclusiveness. That inclusiveness may be getting innovators into the groups, or including more diversity of the type, you know, the human type of diversity we keep talking about, but at least increase the inclusiveness of the standards making process. And I think that will bring new blood into the whole thing and new ideas.
Thank you, Mary. Lena, please.
Yes, Chantal, I agree with Mary's comment on inclusiveness. I would add agility. We need to be agile, and we need to be able to respond more quickly to the...
Shayla, please.
I had different comments written down, and after this discussion, I'm going to summarize it as: be bold, be brave, and embrace disruption.
Eric, please.
I'll pick one of several, and that is to intentionally target lowering the burdens of the North, Global South divide. More than anything else, that divide is creating huge impediments for progress.
Christophe, you have the last words. One thing.
This is going to be a tough one, because I kind of agree to everything that has been said. But I would like to share one experience that we made in the ISO Council when we started to embark on the journey of a next strategy. And it was the experience of, if we think like about the 2-3 year period, nobody is willing to really question the status quo. If we're targeting something that is 10 years ahead, everybody is convinced it will be completely different, and we need to be brave to really rethink things from a systematic point of view, looking from a user's perspective. And that's exactly what Mary said. We need to envision what is a digital quality infrastructure, which essentially will function differently than today's quality infrastructure, which means the role of standardization is going to be different. If you need to think out of the box, you need to think more long term. which will in the end also affect decisions that you do for tomorrow.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for participating and being willing to dive in those questions, and not easy questions. I think it was very, very a lot of good ideas, a lot of food for thought. I'm happy that we did this looking into the next 50 years, not just for SCC, but for standardization as a whole. In lieu of a speaker gift, because you're not here with us, we're all in our separate places, SCC will be making a contribution to Ingenium Foundation in your name. The mission of that foundation is to share the human stories of Canadian innovation and to inspire the next generation of innovators. So again, thank you very much, panelists. We will now pause for 5 minutes. We're back at 3:05 Ottawa time for the rest of the event. Thank you so much, everyone. See you in 5. Welcome back, everyone. We will now move on to the annual public meeting this afternoon. I would like to invite Colin Clark, our acting chair, to share some highlights from the past year and our priorities for the future. Colin, please.
Thank you, Chantal, and good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi à toutes et à tous. It's my pleasure to be serving as the acting chair of the Governing Council of the Standards Council of Canada. C'est aussi un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici afin.
It's a great honor for me to be with you to share the accomplishments of the SCC over the last year and to talk about the direction that we are going in.
My goals today are briefly to share highlights of SCC's achievements this year, to talk a little bit about where we're headed, and address some questions I received from you prior to the meeting. It's very hard to follow that exhilarating panel we just had, but I'll try to keep my remarks brief. It's an exciting time for the organization with so many new prospects for standards and standardization. In seizing these opportunities, SCC's focus this past year has been twofold: reach and impact. And throughout 2019-2020, SCC broadened its engagement with stakeholders and sought places and ways to use standardization as a way of bringing economic, social, and environmental benefits to Canada. Those initiatives began to pay off almost immediately, and we continue to develop them even as we pursue new opportunities. Nous avons vu la normalisation avoir des effets.
We saw standardization have effects that are positive for the Canadian population.
Our program, for example, directly supported Canada's innovation and skills plan and helped foster free trade within our country. We brought stakeholders together to determine how standardization can contribute to smart data governance in Canada, so that personal privacy will be protected in the digital transformation. As a signatory to the UN Declaration for Gender Responsive Standards, we became one of the first national standards organizations in the world to develop a strategy for improving gender equality in standards. With Chantal's appointment to the International Organization for Standardization Council, we amplified our global voice and gained opportunities to advance Canadian interests among peer nations. Our efforts in transportation, infrastructure, and construction have helped open new, sustainable, and climate-resilient pathways for Canadians, including communities in the North. As we continue to work directly with innovative companies to help them use standardization to gain access to markets, some of those companies' technologies have promising applications in the fight against COVID-19. Avec l'épidémie de COVID-19 qui est arrivée,
the COVID pandemic that ended at the end, or began at the beginning of our financial year last year, the strength of our network were tested.
COVID-19 crisis intensified. We leveraged our well-established partnerships with the members of the standardization system to help companies maintain business continuity and, where possible, adapt their operations to meet the country's need for medical equipment. We've seen that same kind of cooperation and collaboration among SCC staff, who adjusted rapidly and successfully to a remote working model after we closed our office on March the 15th, 2020. It takes dedicated and engaged people to stay creative and innovative through challenging times. SCC is fortunate to have such people. Our staff continue to stay engaged and passionate about their work, all the while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. This engagement has been echoed by our partners who continue to join forces with us, so all may rely on a strong and resilient standardization system. I commend Chantal for her inspiring leadership of SCC throughout this global pandemic. It's no surprise then that SCC was recently recognized as one of Canada's most admired corporate cultures. After learning about that award, I reflected on the culture at SCC with the benefit of having been a member of the Governing Council for a few years now. Something I've experienced firsthand is the fact that people enjoy working at SCC, not only for the exciting, challenging work, but also because they feel cared for. This sentiment makes a big difference for employees and employers. I raise this because I'm noticing the concept of leading with care gaining attention in the media. Caring leadership profoundly transforms the traditional image of leadership. À mon avis, l'approche empathetique.
In my opinion, an empathetic approach with flexibility, what the SCC adopted as an organization allows us to continue to succeed in these unprecedented times.
I'd say that we're very pleased with SCC's reach and impact this past year. With our achievements in 2019-2020, we laid the foundation for even greater impact going forward. In that respect, I'd like to say a few words about today's theme, standardization for the benefit of humanity. For a long time, standards were commonly linked with tools and equipment, buildings and services, vehicles, science and technology. Now standards are associated with all manner of goods, services, processes, and social and economic norms. In fact, with practically every aspect of our modern lives. As we heard during the panel discussion, we're now in a world where standards also serve as levers to advance some of our most pressing social and economic issues. Issues such as gender equality, equal access to healthcare, and climate change adaptation. For example, a significant project for SCC this year is the 50-30 Challenge, an initiative to increase gender equality, diversity, and inclusion on corporate boards and in senior management. The Government of Canada is looking to SCC to develop a national guidance document for the 50-30 Challenge, which will later be developed into a national standard of Canada, and ultimately an accreditation program or certification. It's an example of standardization advancing an issue of critical importance, inclusivity and equality. SCC will conduct this work by doing what we do best, bringing experts and stakeholders together to collaborate and develop consensus-based solutions. I don't know about you, but I'm thrilled about SCC's momentum right now and eager to see how far it can take us over the next 50 years. Bien que l'année combien tout.
Even though the year that we all experienced, the past year was very challenging, as we've said, Chantal and panelists as well, there's a lot of hope on the horizon.
Heading into this next year, I can assure you that SCC's council is dedicated to helping SCC use standardization as a way of bringing economic, social, and environmental benefits to Canada. On behalf of the Governing Council, I extend sincere appreciation to Chantal for her able leadership and to all SCC employees for their integral roles in the success of SCC during the past year. I wish also to express our gratitude to Governing Council member Kathy Milsom, who so proficiently steered SCC as chair of from 2013 until the expiry of her second term last year in 2020. I'd also like to thank Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada for their continued collaboration. Our appreciation also goes to all our partners within the vast system who work relentlessly with us to make Canada safer, healthier, and more prosperous. Finally, I thank each of you. Merci beaucoup. Let's work together.
Thank you very much.
To open a world of opportunities. Chantal and I will now answer some questions that were sent to us prior to the meeting. Over to you, Chantal.
Thank you very much, Colin. We did receive a number of questions prior to the meeting. We will not be going over all of them in details, but we have grouped them in themes so we can address several questions at a time. An important question we received was, how are we able to influence government regulatory agencies to reference ISO standards instead of writing detailed technical regulations of their own? Regulators are a very important stakeholder group of SCC. We promote the uptake of standards by referencing them in regulations and policy. One key activity we are doing this year is SCC's working with the Federal Regulatory Review led by the Treasury Board Secretariat, which specifically focus this year on finding ways to enable regulations to be more agile, transparent, and responsive, and exploring how international standards will be used to achieve this objective. Another important work we did last year, we have continued our work with our provincial and territorial advisory committee to align regulatory requirements across Canada. One success was the work done for pressure equipment such as water heaters. We were able to support the negotiation and agreement on a single design review process instead of 7 that will lead to efficiency and obviously reduce costs. You can find more examples in our annual report. Back to you, Colin.
Thank you, Chantal. We also received a number of questions related to SCC's future and how will it evolve based on the past year. What I can tell you is that Governing Council, along with SCC management, have been reflecting for a number of months, and we came to the conclusion that the same 3 strategic priorities that we have in our corporate plan still hold true. Firstly, SCC continues to be committed to fostering innovations that contribute directly to Canadian prosperity and well-being, with greater particular focus on the digital economy and climate change, and more emphasis in this planning period on health. The second priority is around Canadian leadership, and SCC will continue to create opportunities for Canada by leading nationally, regionally, and internationally to deliver on Canada's priorities through standardization. One example is the work that SCC does in the AI or intelligence sector, where we help bring leadership to the forefront by having Canada both be the convener and project editor of the ISO Technical Committee on Foundational Artificial Intelligence Standards. And we will continue our work with academia, advancing gender responsive standards, reduce internal trade barriers, just to name a few. And finally, our third priority, which is organizational excellence, remains. We'll continue to ensure that we put an emphasis on our employees, that the delivery model is adapted to provide greater efficiency for stakeholders and meet their evolving needs, and that SCC's impact continues to grow. I invite you to read our next corporate plan for all the details, which should be available in the coming months. Thanks. Back to Chantal.
Thank you, Colin. I would invite anybody in the future to submit any questions you might have around our activities at info@scc.ca. We will now move to our finale, and I'm delighted to have the honor to revealing the winners of the 2020 SCC Awards. Every 2 years, we present Canada's national awards in standardization to recognize the dedicated and remarkable people who strengthen our standardization network. J'aimerais remercier toutes celles et ceux qui ont pris le temps
to thank all of those who took the time to submit a candidate for these awards. We have experienced an exceptional year in 2020. The pandemic showed us how standardization was vital when it came to protecting global populations, specifically in such troubling times.
Of our technical committee members ensures Canada continues to prosper despite global uncertainty. As we mark our 50th anniversary and reflect on the future possibilities standardization can unlock, I am proud to share their inspiring stories with you. First, the UCRANS Award goes to Fred Lieber. As SCC's top honor, this award recognizes the exceptional contribution of an individual in Canada's standardization network. With more than 45 years in the life safety and fire protection field, Fred has become a distinguished leader known for his vast expertise, his integrity, and advocacy for Canadian priorities. Le prix de dévouement décerné aux entreprises.
The Dedication Award thanks the dedication of a group or an organization within the context of national standardization or international standardization. The 2020 award is given to Réseau Normalisation and Francophonie. Their initiatives in the Francophone sector give women, young people, and next generation of entrepreneurs the way of moving forward.
Consensus building, productivity, and multidisciplinary cooperation demonstrated by a standards-related committee. This award goes to the committee behind the Healthy Enterprise Standard, CAN BNQ 9700-800. The standard reflects today's realities and the importance of safeguarding the health and wellness of Canada's workforce to the shared benefits of both employers and employees. SCC's Young Leader Award recognizes leaders of tomorrow by honoring an outstanding standardization professional under the age of 40. The 2020 recipient is Jillian Wintonick. Jillian's passion for using standards to improve public safety has led her to work in standards development and become a strong advocate for gender equality in the profession. Finally, the Mcmahon Dedicated Service Award recognizes the exceptional dedication and contributions of an SCC staff member. This award goes to Christine Gerarti, Project Manager, International Technical Committee Secretariat at the Standards Council. I thank and applaud you, Christine, for your 20 years of service at SCC. Your diligence and vast knowledge, as well as the incredible support and advice you provide to high-profile technical committees, ensure Canadian priorities advance at an international level. A big congratulations and round of applause for the 2020 SCC Award recipients. This brings us to the end of our virtual celebration. I hope you enjoyed this afternoon. If you're interested in exploring an area of standardization you're not familiar with or new to you, please do not hesitate to participate. You can always visit our website to join our community. Before we leave, there's a beautiful video that is going to be shown that celebrates the exceptional 2020 winners and their achievements. Thank you, everybody. Take care and stay safe.
I was initially introduced to standards, the standards system, if you will, when my boss couldn't attend a meeting and he sent me instead. Turned out to be a big mistake for him because they liked me better than they liked him. I was at a meeting in Vienna where we were debating the Vienna Agreement, and they set up an ad hoc group, including Canada, to try to work through what the requirements were and how we would apply the Vienna Agreement. I mean, this is some time ago, but imagine they invited a Canadian to be a part of this thing. Again, going back to, having learned to become a mediator, if you will. In Canada, Underwriters Laboratories, ULC S527 is the control unit standard. And I was a member of that committee early on. I was chair for a while. And it happened that I was there during the transition from discrete circuits, hardwired components, to digital circuitry. And it was unbelievable. Most of these meetings are in dark rooms, in basement conference rooms or in rooms where the blinds are drawn so that you're not distracted. These meetings were unbeknownst to the majority of the population. And to be recognized for having done it is really something. it's awesome that the Standards Council of Canada has actually brought forward this award to me. I love it. It's great.
Les normes sont au cœur du développement économique et social des pays. Elles favorisent l'accès à de nouveaux marchés, facilitent les exportations, assurent la santé, la sécurité publique et aussi aident les pays dans leurs longs efforts vers la réalisation des objectifs du développement durable.
Alors, la normalisation, c'est un important levier pour la francophonie économique. Alors, nous, notre objectif au réseau Normalisation et Francophonie, c'est de promouvoir la normalisation et son utilité pour les pays francophones. Alors, concrètement, nous accompagnons les pays pour les aider à mieux utiliser les normes et à mieux participer à l'élaboration des normes. Au total, on regroupe 30 pays de l'espace francophone et c'est avec eux qu'on travaille au quotidien pour créer de la valeur dans les entreprises des entrepreneurs francophones.
Donc, nous sommes extrêmement reconnaissants envers le Conseil canadien des normes pour cette distinction que nous recevons avec beaucoup de fierté. Nous tenons également à remercier sincèrement Investissement Québec et plus particulièrement le Bureau de normalisation du Québec et son directeur principal, M. Jean Rousseau, qui est également vice-président Amérique du Nord du RNF et qui a pris l'initiative de soumettre la candidature du RNF pour ce prix.
Alors, les comités de normalisation se distinguent de d'autres groupes de discussion ou de d'autres forums par le fait que ce sont des groupes multipartites qui représentent différents points de vue et équilibrés. Ces façons de faire mettent en place un climat de discussion qui favorise une dynamique que les gens des comités reconnaissent rapidement et voient rapidement que l'objectif est de chercher à atteindre une amélioration et pas nécessairement la perfection. Dans des entreprises, on rencontrait souvent des pratiques organisationnelles qui pouvaient aider à la santé ou au mieux-être des employés et qui souvent étaient pas nécessairement complètes. Et en élaborant cette norme-là, l'objectif a été de pouvoir fournir aux entreprises qui se préoccupent de la santé, du mieux-être de leurs employés, physique et psychologique, de leur donner une démarche et un modèle structuré et complet. Tout le monde a fini par converger vers l'idée de vouloir améliorer des choses et d'en arriver à une norme qui serait mise en place, qui serait utilisée et qui ne resterait pas sur la tablette. Alors, je remercie beaucoup le Conseil canadien des normes et pour leur encadrement également, qui fait en sorte que les normes canadiennes sont des normes de qualité.
Being in standards development really requires you to wear a lot of different hats. So you're analytical, you're technical, you also need to use your soft skills. There's a ton of communication, collaboration. The evolving needs of those skills is really what keeps me here. It's new every day, it's really enjoyable. So my work up until now has really been focused on safety standards related to solid fuel burning appliances, chimneys and vents. A lot of the work we've been doing lately is around using these standards to realize some efficiencies in terms of creating these joint North American standards. Well, now is a really exciting time in our organization and in the standardization area as a whole, I think, because we're undergoing a huge shift in terms of modernization of our systems, of our processes, of how we involve with our stakeholders. So for me, in terms of where I see myself in the next few years, is really developing and rolling out some of these modern solutions and engaging stakeholders in different ways. I'd like to thank the Standards Council of Canada for giving me this award. It means a lot to me for the recognition as being the young leader.
I've been at the Standards Council of Canada nearly 20 years now, and I started in the standards branch, working to support both international and national standards development. And over time, I have moved up to work more closely with the stakeholders involved at the international level in particular, and now even more closely as committee manager and secretary for specific international committees under both ISO and IEC, where not only am I supporting the Canadian leaders and experts involved in these committees, but also the experts and leaders participating from all over the world. Throughout my 20 years at the Standards Council of Canada, my colleagues have been my role models and a true inspiration to encourage me to perform my best every day. I am so honored to be receiving the Mcmahon Dedicated Service Award from the Standards Council of Canada. It means so much to me because I have done so much to work with all of the stakeholders and to support them, and as well to work with and support my teammates at the Standards Council of Canada in the standards branch.